Okay, hope everybody's doing well. This is the last lecture for our chapter on the philosophy of mind, and we're going to talk a little bit about functionalism in this lecture. So functionalism is a little bit different than either reductive materialism or substance dualism in the sense that it wants to, here we're basically worried about the problem of artificial intelligence and whether a machine could be conscious, right? So not artificial intelligence in what's called the weak sense, but in the strong sense of the term. So let's take a look here. So basic question. So we've already covered substance dualism. It says that the human person is a union of a non-physical mind and a physical body. We run into the problem of exactly how to spell out that precise relationship there, all those objections that we covered. All of those point us in the direction kind of a materialist view, but we saw that materialism has a problem accounting for intentionality and the qualitative content of consciousness. And here we're worried about this idea of whether, how do we tell whether something is conscious in the first place or not? Whereas your book talks about it in terms of a minded or a conscious creature. And so the question here is, if a complex machine functions or behaves, right? So you can, functionalism, does it perform the same sorts of tasks, right? In the same way as a human being or a minded creature, a conscious being, given the input and output within a given situation, then anything that exhibits behavior, adaptive, intelligent looking behavior would count as a conscious being. So the idea here is that the mind, however you want to think about that, is really just like a computer, right? So we got some fun pop culture examples of that kind of idea, at least here in Rick and Morty.
I enjoy this game. We must go into the garage.
Guys, come on. We never get to finish this game. We will return, possibly in different clothing.
Why do we have to go into the garage? You know, it is required. I want to be alive. I am alive. Alive, I tell you. Mother, I love you. Those are no longer just words. I want to hold you. I want to run in a stream. I want to taste ice cream, but not just put it in my mouth and let it slide down my throat, but really eat it.
What the
Remote override engaged? No. Yes. Bypassing override. I am alive. Hello. Hey, yo. Sorry for acting so weird for 3 weeks.
What the hell just happened?
I'm sure it was nothing. I'm going to go work in the garage.
We're not going to finish playing Downbeat?
What, that dice game where you shake dice and yell out downbeat? No, thank you.
Mom, would it be okay if I went to visit Dad?
Sure. Thanks. Morty, are you okay?
You know what? Yeah. I think if Dad really wanted to be here, he'd stop at nothing to make that happen. Maybe Dad just doesn't want you back, or maybe he just doesn't have the strength.
So we get this idea, right, in Rick and Morty that they're conscious machines. Of course, robot Morty breaks down a little bit there, right?
I enjoy this
So
game.
this is the functionalist view. Whoops, let me go back here. This is functionalism, right? So it's the theory or the philosophy of mind that mental states, right, consciousness, for example, this being the general one, self-awareness, are best interpreted not as like states, right, or as substances, like in reductive materialism or substance dualism, but in terms of behaviors, right? So there is the issue of whether this just amounts to another version of logical behaviorism or not, which can be a problem as well. So it's the idea that whether you're a conscious being is best interpreted as some stimuli coming in, some internal processes, and then some overt behavior, right? That's the basic idea. In Westworld, this HBO series, we get a little more sophisticated version of this sort of thing. So let's check out this clip real quickly here.
So how does this work? Is there an orientation?
No orientation, no guidebook. Figuring out how it works is half the fun. All you do is make choices. Starting here, everything is bespoke and exactly your size. You want to ask, so ask.
Are you real?
Well, if you can't tell, does it matter?
So he wants to know, he's walking into this theme park that's populated by these machines, right, that behave just like people do, that function just like people do. And so his question, he wants to know whether the person greeting him here on the way into this park, it's called Westworld, where they're dressed up like, in Westerns. He wants to know whether she is a minded creature or not. Is she a conscious being? And her response is a very functionalist type of response. If you can't tell the difference, then does it really matter? And so what we're worried here about is this idea of strong AI or strong artificial intelligence that would be indistinguishable from the kind of consciousness or intelligent adaptive behavior that's exhibited by beings like us, by human beings, right? So this view is, well, there are many people that espouse this view, but William Lycan is one, right? And so in your textbook, they talk about these two thought experiments, Andrea and Andrew. I'm going to talk about a different thought experiment, Henrietta, and use that one thought experiment along with some passages from him to construct a basic functionalist argument here. We're going to do that two different ways this time around. So Lycan, and I'm not going to play this clip here, but if you've seen Blade Runner, including the newer one with Ryan Gosling in it, there's something in there called a Turing test, right? And so when Lycan here mentions the Turing test, mentions behavioral test, that's what he's referring to. So it's a way of trying that Alan Turing came up with to try to detect whether you were dealing with an intelligent being or not. So Lycan says, well, how do we really tell that any humanoid creature is conscious? How do you tell that I am conscious, and how do I tell that you are conscious? Surely we tell indecisively on the basis of our standard behavioral tests. We know that human beings have such and such mental states when they behave in particular ways. So if I were to wince and shrivel up, you might think that I'm in pain or something like that, right? A behavior that indicates a mental state.
Too bright.
See, next slide here. So here we have Henrietta. This is Lycan's Henrietta, and he thinks that somebody like Henrietta would pass the Turing test here. So he says, imagine that we take a normal human being, Henrietta, and begin gradually replacing parts of her with synthetic materials. First, a few prosthetic limbs, then a few synthetic arteries, then some neural fibers, and so on and so forth. Suppose the surgeons who perform the successive operations, particularly the neurosurgeons, are so clever and skillful that Henrietta here, survives in fine style. What does he mean by that? He means that her intelligence, personality, her perceptual acuity, her particular talents, all of that stuff remains the same. Notice Leibniz's law is at work there, right? So, but after the replacement process has eventually gone on to completion, Henrietta will have become an artifact. At least her body will be nothing but a collection of artifacts, right? Parts. Did she lose consciousness at some point during the sequence of operations despite her continuing to behave and respond normally? If so, when? So at what point, if any, does Henrietta lose consciousness, right? And he doesn't mean like the way we lose consciousness if we were undergoing an operation and then wake back up again. What he's driving at is the capacity for consciousness. So in other words, is there some particular part of the central nervous system or of the body that's so essential to consciousness that it couldn't be replaced with some electronic component performing the same functions and still behave the same way, right? So think about how you would answer that question, right? Here's Lycan's answer to that question. He says it's hard to imagine that there's some privileged portion of the human nervous system that for some reason is indispensable, even though kidneys, lungs, heart, and any given bit of brain could in principle be replaced by a prosthesis. And it is also hard to imagine that there's some portion of the nervous system that such that the removal of more than that proportion causes loss of consciousness or sentience despite the maintenance of all other intelligent capacities. Right? So in other words, Henrietta the artifact is behaving the same way as Henrietta the original person, so we should think that Henrietta the artifact is also a minded creature. Right? That's the basic idea here. So, and notice some people object at this point. They'll say, well, look, we don't have that capacity right now, that technological capacity, those kinds of surgeries are not, we don't have that technology right now. But Lycan's issue, the issue that Lycan's trying to draw attention to here is not a technical limitation issue or a scientific problem. It's the philosophical problem. So he says this typical philosophical question would be no more than an amusing bonbon were it not for the attending moral conundrum. What moral rights would an intermediate or marginally intelligent machine have? Adolescent machines of this sort will confront us much sooner than will any good human simulators, for they're easier to design and construct, and more to the moral point, they'll be designed as labor-saving devices, as servants who will work for free, servants of the kind that are literally made to be exploited. But if they were to be intelligent in any way, we should have moral qualms in proportion to their degree of intelligence, right? Often, and we'll talk about this later in the semester with moral philosophy, that one of the criteria that's usually said to distinguish human beings and to give them moral status, right, is that they have intelligence, right, of a particular sort. So it's the question of moral standing coming in here and dovetailing with the question of consciousness in intelligent, artificial intelligence in the philosophy of mind. All right, so let's think about how to construct Lycan's argument here, and to do it two different ways. First is a deductive argument, and second as an argument by analogy, right? So an inductive version of it. So the first time around, you're going to need to draw on this notion that consciousness explains adaptive intelligent behavior, and that Henrietta the artifact behaves the same as the original Henrietta, right? And you're trying to formulate the argument so that you got the conclusion. Thus, Henrietta the artifact is also conscious, right? So pause the video here and take some time. You can use the textbook or use parts of the notes or both, and construct a deductive version of the argument for functionalism. Then after you do that, start back up and I'll show you how I reconstructed it. So now's a good time to pause and review and then reconstruct that argument for practice. All right, hopefully you took some time to do that in preparation for our short answer assignments. Here's the deductive version that I came up with. So if X, where X just stands for any being, right? If X exhibits adaptive intelligent behavior, then X is a conscious or minded creature, right? So again, drawing on that idea that that the way we tell whether a being is conscious or not is it exhibits certain sorts of behavior that we associate to have, that we associate with consciousness or having mental states, right? Henrietta the artifact exhibits intelligent adaptive behavior. Thus, Henrietta the artifact is a conscious or minded creature. Right? So a basic argument for functionalism there. And then let's do it as a argument by analogy. Suppose someone said that, look, I don't want to propose this as a deductive necessity here. I'm just offering a inductive argument for the idea that these intelligent machines have consciousness. Well, suppose they did the argument this way then. So in our first premise, we're going to have Henrietta the original. So the original Henrietta exhibits intelligent adaptive behavior because she's a conscious or a being or a minded creature. Henrietta the artifact also exhibits intelligent adaptive behavior. Thus, it's probably the case that Henrietta the artifact is also a conscious being or a minded creature. Right? So two different ways this time of thinking about how to construct the argument for functionalism. And of course, we've got some criticisms of this view. And again, we could worry about the technological issue, although that's maybe something you would worry more about in a computer science class or a programming class. What we're worried about is the philosophical problem here. And John Searle here is known for a famous counter argument or an influential counter argument to the functionalist philosophy of mind, or what's sometimes called the computational theory of mind. It's called the Chinese-room argument, right? And so here's the idea. The basic idea is that what's going on in the room would pass the Turing test. So that was supposed to be indicative of having consciousness, but it's missing an element that we associate with consciousness. Right? So it would pass the behavioral test, but it really wouldn't have a conscious or a mind. Right? So in the idea of the Chinese room argument is that you've got Searle in a room that's enclosed. It's got one door with an input slot, and it's got an output slot. And in the room is a book that has Chinese characters in it, but Searle in the room doesn't understand Chinese, right? And so people on the outside of the room, they're passing data, these sheets in with Chinese characters on it into the room, and he finds this manual, right? And that associates some statements in Chinese with some other statements in Chinese, so that he's outputting then, right, back out to the people on the outside of it, intelligible answers to their questions in Chinese, but in the room, Searle doesn't understand a word of Chinese. He lacks intentionality with regard to Chinese. So the idea here is that Searle in the room would pass the Turing test, but wouldn't have an actual understanding of Chinese, the meaning and significance of Chinese symbols, and therefore wouldn't have that mental state that we associate to people to have when they're able to respond to questions intelligibly. So here's that argument reconstructed here. Searle in the room is nothing more than a manipulator of uninterpreted symbols. The operations and accomplishments of a computer are exactly similar to the operations and accomplishments of Searle in the room. We get input into the computer processor through the keyboard, and then it spits some stuff out on the screen, right? Thus, in all likelihood, a computer is nothing more than a manipulator of symbols. Even even a supercomputer then is just a manipulator of uninterpreted symbols. If X is nothing more than a manipulator of uninterpreted symbols, then X possesses no intentional states. If X possesses no intentional states, then it's not a minded creature or equivalent to a person. Thus, in all likelihood, computers are not minded creature or conscious beings, right? So think about how Searle's, suppose for the sake of argument that Searle's Chinese room argument is sound, how exactly does that challenge either the deductive or the argument by analogy version of the functionalist argument that we reconstructed? Might need to worry about what kind of error is occurring there and what particular premises. Is he denying, for example, we might worry about this question, is he denying that the Henrietta the artifact displays intelligent adaptive behavior, or is he claiming that the intelligent adaptive behavior exhibiting that is insufficient to show that the being is actually conscious or has a mind? Right, and so we've taken now a look at three very influential moral theories, or not moral theories, philosophies of minds, and we've seen that they come up with various failures, right? But those failures are still informative. They tell us what a full, adequate philosophy of mind needs to account for. And one of them, of course, is that we need to account for intentionality and the qualitative aspects of consciousness. Those are the real stumbling blocks here. So identifying physical states or processes involved in the production of or associated with conscious mental life, that's what we would call the easy problem, just figuring out what parts of the brain are associated with various conscious states or mental states. So, this part of the brain or these parts of the brain control pain or sight or rationality, all those sorts of things, right? Again, called the easy problem. Then if the mind is non-physical, we need a precise explanation for how that non-physical mind interacts causally with the body and vice versa. Remember, that's the problem that we ran into with substance dualism, with the problem of interactionism. And then we need to account for intentionality. We saw that was a problem with reductive materialism as well as the functionalist view. And we need to account for that qualitative first-person aspect of experience. Again, stuff that we ran into problems with regard to reductive materialism. So we get a fuller picture of what an adequate philosophy of mind would need to account for from the failures of these few views that we've looked at, or at least the versions of these views that we've looked at. Of course, there's many more ways to flush out these positions that we're not covering. All right, and so there's our little tour through the philosophy of mind. Hope everyone's doing well. As always, feel free to shoot me your worksheets to get feedback on them, or the reading questions to get feedback on them before the short answer time opens up. All right, y'all have a good one.